He met his victims on Grindr. His MO was that they were gay, Irish men, and living alone. He went to his place, and he stabbed him over 40 times. He decapitated him, placed his head on the bed, facing the door.
Yeah, he can deny it all he wants, and he can say that's forbidden under Islam, but I think it's very clear.
Yeah.
Clearly gay.
Yeah.
Sarah, thank you very much for sitting down and joining me. I appreciate you taking the time. And we might start off by going into your background, how you became interested in true crime generally, and even to the point of becoming a criminologist.
Well, my background is in covering courts and crime. So I'm from Cork, like yourself, County Cork, North Cork, grew up in Bantir near Mallow and Kanturk, went to college in UCG and did arts there, sociology, politics, history. And then I studied communications or journalism at postgrad in UCG. And actually, I lived in Sligo for 5 years after that. That was where my first job was, in Northwest Radio, the local radio in Sligo. So that's where I kind of cut my teeth in journalism. So I know Sligo well. I haven't been back there now in a few years, but obviously, having lived there for 5 years, I would know it quite well. And then I went on to go to INN, which is kind of the equivalent of Bauer Media, which is, distributing news to all of this radio stations around the country. And I kind of fell into, my boss said, okay, well, I'm sending you down to the courts today. And it was a huge trial at the time, the Annabelle trial, in relation to the death of Brian Murphy. A number of Blackrock students went on trial at the time. And I was sent down to this huge high profile trial, my first experience of the courts in Dublin. And that was it. I ended up in the courts for years and years, for nearly 20 years. And so that's where, my interest, obviously, in criminology really started. I kind of, in a way, I suppose, found my natural home in terms of the interest I had in it. I would have covered a lot of the really high-profile murder trials at the time. And a lot of those trials then were femicide trials, high-profile killings by men of women. The Joe O'Reilly trial of Rachel Callally, his wife, Rachel O'Reilly Callally, which was a gruesome murder in 2004. And we had the murder of Siobhan Carney by her husband, Brian Carney. And then there was obviously the murder trial of Eamon Lillis, accused of the murder of his wife, Celine Cawley, but he was convicted later of manslaughter. So a lot of high profile trials, but a lot of not so high profile trials that I would have covered as well. And I remember sitting there and going, you can nearly write the template of what's going to happen here in terms of the relationship and the power and control and the nuances involved, and that these women wanted to leave these men. They were either threatening to leave or they had left when they were killed. And of course, we know, like, since 1996, I think it's 263 women have died violently here in Ireland. It's a major issue. And I think 87% of those women died at the hands of either a partner or former partner, somebody they knew. So that was naturally, this was what I became immersed in huge trials. And criminology then, for me, a friend of mine had been studying it in DIT, now TUI Dublin, and I decided I was going to do that course. And so I graduated in 2011. And when I was doing the criminology course, John, it was interesting. I wanted to go in, I kind of had an idealistic view of criminology, and most people do that haven't studied it. And, it was a very sociology-based master's. You could bring the psychology into it. I was a little disappointed there wasn't a bit more psychology in it, but it was very sociology-based. But I did manage to get a meeting with John Lonergan. I don't know if you've heard of John Lonergan. He was the Mountjoy prison governor for 26 years. We actually interviewed him on our Real Lives Untold podcast. And I met him and I said, look, I want to interview 20 men who have killed women or have killed. And he said, absolutely. But unfortunately, it's not as easy as that. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, and there's a research ethics committee. And in the end, I didn't get in. There were a number of reasons, but really because I wasn't going to be supervised and it was a master's. So I had to turn that around, and I did my research on the pitfalls of prison research, which means that, it's very difficult to get into prisons because the prison population is so protected. So I did my master's in criminology, and I continued. I went into TV then in UTV Ireland, set up a television channel here in 2014. And then TV3, you know, TV3, it's TV station based in Dublin. It's national, and it then took over UTV Ireland, and then Virgin Media Ireland purchased TV3. So I was in Virgin Media until just last year as their crime and courts correspondent. So the criminology was lovely, kind of, it was complementary, you know. So my interest in it, especially at crime scenes, you'd always have an interest when you go to the courts and you're hearing the end product of what happened and how it was investigated. But when you go to crime scenes first, you're at the very start of that process. You're trying to figure out and analyze what happened here, and you're looking at, you know, I covered a lot of gangland crime, the Kinnan Hutch feud, but there were also, you know, murders all around the country as well that I would have covered. So, and then I've set up this podcast, Real Lives Untold, with my lovely colleague and fellow criminologist, Trina O'Connor. Not related, and she's not from Cork. And we launched that this year, so it's really interesting.
If it might be kind of tough to gauge, but how much of your interest in going into criminology was more like serial killers? How much was the more common type of crime, you know, like kind of drugs related things that have a kind of a clear motive, you know?
I suppose, yeah, like with gangland, it's not rocket science. You know, the motive is usually it's money and drugs, you know, and territory and turf, and somebody ratting somebody out. But with the other murders, with the domestic murders, obviously, you know, you could nearly, as I said, write the script. But then there were some random murders also, and I covered obviously the Aishling Murphy murder in January 2022, and we know that her murderer has been convicted, Yousef Puska. He's about to be sentenced actually, and handed down the mandatory sentence on Friday. So I'm just going to use that as an example, because that was really difficult, I think, for society here and the psyche to understand, because it's a rarity here. A lot of the murders are either gangland, they're knife-related crimes, or you know, where it might be sporadic drug-fueled, drink-fueled fights, or they are domestic issues. They're domestic homicides. But it's very rare that you get that there's somebody is murdered so randomly like that, when there's no reason. And it was made very clear to us at the beginning that they were not known to each other, that Aishling Murphy and Yousef Puska weren't known to each other. They just lived in the same area in Tullamore and County Offaly in the Midlands of Ireland. And so that's the kind of scenario that you're trying to constantly figure it out. And I remember from the very beginning, when we got there that day, there was a press conference the day after she was killed around 3:30 on the 12th of January 2022. But the following morning there was a press conference, and there was something I just got instinctively. I thought, this seems to be, they had arrested a man just soon after the killing, and he was in custody. So, but they were still very much looking for more information, which is common. Obviously, they want all the evidence they can to gather for a case against a suspect. But it just seemed like they were keeping a very open mind. And this continued throughout the day. And I remember that evening, the commissioner, Drew Harris, came down, because this was something that it was like the whole of Ireland just took a breath and were completely shocked by this girl, this really successful, she was a teacher, a musician, somebody who was very much loved, an all-rounder, beautiful girl that was just struck down at 3:30 in the day as she was exercising by the canal in Tullamore. And this was something, and I'm just giving this as an example, that this was something that kind of was very unusual here. And you might hear of it, like there was a girl in the UK in the previous year, I can't remember her name right now, but that had been, the same thing had happened to her in a park. But for the whole nation, we all kind of took a breath. And I remember later that day when Drew Harris came down and they talked about this bike, this Falcon Storm bike that was Yousef Puska's bike, it turned out. Meanwhile, they still had this first man in custody, and they were, you know, they were appealing for information about the bike, and this, to me, it just seemed they were bringing all this information in, and it was a bit random. And I was like, I don't know why I asked the question that evening, and it was just before I went live on Virgin Media News it was about 5:15. Our bulletin was at 5:30, and I asked Drew Harris. I said, "Well, you're saying that you're keeping an open mind about this, but you have a suspect, and are you not worried that this might alarm the public that possibly you have the wrong man?" And he answered it. Said we always have to keep an open mind in investigations. But a few hours later, it turned out we were informed suspect released. That's the end of that, and that would be really almost, in my experience, it was unprecedented that something like this would happen. And so it was a case of, as we found out during the trial, that the two women who had witnessed, who had been exercising along the canal at that same time, come across Yousef Puska when he was holding Aishling down in the ditch beside the canal. And at that stage, he had stabbed her 11 times and he had cut her throat and rendering her silence, so she couldn't speak, and she couldn't scream for help, and so all she could do was kick her legs, those scissors kicks. And I remember hearing the evidence and thinking, God, that is so chilling, that they didn't know what was happening. They didn't have a phone, those two women. But when they eventually, and they alerted help, but by the time, unfortunately, people got back there and CPR was administered, it was too late for Aishling. But those women identified the first suspect out of a lineup, and he had lived nearby, and they said, well, they recognized this, they thought they had recognized the striking eyes. That's what kind of stood out for them, and so they had identified the person. So the guards were just doing their job. I think there was a lot of, oh my God, the guards botched this up from the very beginning, but actually they were just gathering evidence, doing their job, and these women identified this man in the lineup. So of course they're going to interview him, test him for any DNA, and obviously Aishling Murphy had Yousef Puska's DNA under her fingernails, and there was DNA found on the bike. And of course, when they had released him, Yousef Puska then was a suspect, so he was on their radar. So they had to finalize the case in relation to the suspect to completely eliminate him before releasing him. So yeah, I mean, in terms of my interest in crime, a lot of what I would have covered would have been murder. And while it's so dark, it was just something that, because that's what we would have naturally covered. If a murder takes place, you're going to cover it. So I would have been naturally sent to that, and so obviously my interest in why they do this, and because I'd studied criminology, the causes of crime, what are the factors taken into account? Sometimes the factors are fairly obvious, but in other times, like in the Aishling Murphy case, they weren't obvious. They really weren't. And Yousef Palani, I know we're going to talk about that case as well. That was something that bamboozled people also.
Just out of interest, as someone who studied criminology and who works in that world, do you also watch serial killer documentaries and read or consume material about it outside of work? You do?
I do, unfortunately, for my, for my sanity. Yeah, I absolutely would. And, I mean, there was obviously the Jeffrey Dahmer documentary, and there was a number of documentaries on him at the time. And yeah, I would definitely veer towards that type of episode or series, for sure. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Even in books, even in preparing for any of our podcasts, our podcasts are in Real Lives Untold. All our interviewees are, crime related. They're either victims of crime or their families of victims of crime, also victims of crime, or experts in the crime area. This week we've Dr. Pat Leahy, former assistant commissioner, who was, synonymous with the Kinahan Hutch feud in terms of the investigation there. So it's always been my interest, and it is addictive. I mean, there's a huge appetite for crime, and we know why. Even somebody who's been doing it and covering it for so long and studied it, I still have that appetite for finding out why and what was going on and breaking down the psyche. Even though I'm not an expert, I don't have a psychology background, but just it's more about the psyche of these people. And I think when we talk about Puska more and Palani more, we'll see that.
Okay, so we'll go on to Ireland's, you could say, history with serial killers. Arguably we haven't had an actual strict definition by the book serial killer. I don't think so anyway, because I mean, one definition of serial killer is typically person who murders 3 or more people.
Yes,
murders taking place over a month, including a significant period between them. Yeah, another definition: person commits a series of murders, often with no apparent motive and typically following characteristic, predictable behavior pattern. By that definition, we haven't had any. We may have
so many familicides. Unfortunately, the tragedy of familicides, where there would be, at least 3 people killed in one family, but that doesn't fit under the umbrella because it's under that definition, because it's in the same location. It's all at the same time, obviously. But yeah, cooling off period is something to take into account. Spree killers, mass murderers, but serial killers are different because there is more of a cooling off period, especially at the beginning. But when you talk about serial killers in Ireland, our first recorded serial killers, and you may know this already, is the case of John Shaw and Jeffrey Evans. And they were 2 guys from the UK. That's right. And this was in the 70s. And they kind of hatched their plan in the UK. They were career criminals in the UK. They hatched their plan while they were in an English prison to come over to Ireland, because when they'd got out of the prison, they were then wanted in relation to a number of sexual assaults and rapes. So they decided they were going to leave the UK for Ireland, and they vowed and resolved that they would kill 1 woman every week in Ireland in the summer of 1976. And when they got here, I think it was 1974 or so that they got out of prison in the UK. But when they got here, then they were caught for burglary because they were career criminals. This was the only way they knew how to, maintain their lifestyle, was, thieving, burglaries. And so they got caught, and I think they were in Cork prison for a while. And obviously that plan was, discussed even further, but it was and then they were also, trying to avoid being extradited back to the UK for those rapes in the UK. And so they were going around Ireland in the summer of 1976, and their plan was to kill. So this was a compulsion with them, but the fact that the 2 of them were working together, that's unusual as well. They both had the same MO and the same kind of signature, they wanted to, it was a toxic masculinity at that stage, in terms of devaluing women, in terms of the aggression, in terms of the extreme violence involved. And we can't discount that this was complete toxic masculinity on their part. And then what they did was, I think it was in August and September of that year, they first abducted a lady in Wicklow. Her name was Elizabeth Plunkett. And I think it was like side of the road, or they lured her into the car, and they brought her to a woods, and they beat her to render her kind of stunned and defenseless. And they brought her to a woods in County Wicklow, where they raped her and eventually strangled her. And then, in order to dispose of her body, they actually had a boat and sailed out to sea and weighed the body down. But her body was eventually found after they were caught. And then their second victim was a short time later, was in September. So within those few weeks, and that was in County Mayo, and her name was Mary Duffy, another young woman, again, abducted her, stunned her, punched her in the face in order to render her defenseless again. And they actually held her for a time in a tent, where they repeatedly raped her and beat her. And eventually, I think they gave her drugs, held a pillow over her face, and strangled her. And they got rid of her body and disposed of her body in a lake. And the guards at this stage, investigating the 2 murders, linked them immediately. And this was back in 1976, because they knew, obviously, these 2 men were on their radar. They were in Ireland. They were wanted for extradition. This was their MO. They were wanted for rapes. And so they immediately identified them as the chief suspects. And they were arrested. I think it was later in September of that, 1976. And they were arrested. And it was they told the guards where the bodies were. And they were later sentenced to life in prison. And Jeffrey Evans died in prison. I think it was sepsis in 2012. And John Shaw actually was only released from prison, I think it was just last year. So that was the first kind of recorded serial killings that were recorded here. And then we have the case of Michael Bambrick, who was living in St. Ronan's Close in Clondalkin in Dublin. And his killings took place in 1992, or was it 91, 92, the early 90s. And he had a history of, again, assaults against women, aggression, violence against women, completely devaluing women. There was a case of his first marriage that he would actually just on the side of that, he would dress up as a woman and wear lipstick, and his wife at the time and the mother of his child would come home. They would have rows. There was violence there, and he, at that stage, during a row one night, he actually tried to strangle her, and he stuffed tights down her throat. And this was kind of something that he would continue to do. And you could kind of interpret this again, that toxic masculinity element, trying to silence these women. He didn't want them to have a voice. And this was something that he said he enjoyed doing, stuffing tights down their mouths and gagging them. And this woman, so when that was over, he later was convicted of assaulting another woman. And then he went on and he met another woman, Patricia McGauley. And I think they had 2 children together. And it was during the course of a row. And one night he strangled her and locked her body in a box room. And the next day he dismembered her body. And again, when you look at disposing of the body, it was close by. And so that's in terms of serial killers, and particularly in killers that are disorganized. They will use their location nearby where they know to dispose of the bodies. And this is what Michael Bambrick did with his first victim, Patricia McGauley, and that was in 1991. And then 1992, he met a single mother, and the same thing again. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of rows, and during sex with her, he strangled her, and he shoved tights down her mouth, gagged her, and he again disposed of her body similarly, very close to his house, within a kilometer or so of his house, stashed the body in the bedroom, the box room, before dismembering it, and then disposing of the remains. He was later caught, and it was a relative of his said that he would beat them, and that he would also kill their pets. So that is obviously, when you read about serial killers, we often read that they start, they have a compulsion to kill. They want to see what it feels like, and they might start by killing pets. And so in this case, that was an interesting element of it, that he had done that. And there are probably a lot more of them that start doing that, but we don't know about it. We don't hear about it during the cases, but we heard about it in this Michael Bambrick case. And he was later convicted. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and he was eventually released. He's released now. So those were 2, very high profile killings where it was, they're described as serial killers, and there were 2 victims in each case. And then we had Malcolm MacArthur, of course, that everybody will know about, the socialite, came back from Tenerife. It was in the early 80s who came back, and he had blown all his inheritance, and so he needed money, and it was really Machiavellian for him. He was like, I need money, I'm going to rob banks. There was no other way for him to get it, in his mind. So he decided, how do I rob a bank? I need to get a getaway car. Went to the Phoenix Park in 1982. He came across a 27-year-old nurse, Bridie Gargan, who was sunbathing in Phoenix Park, and he demanded that she give him that she hand over the keys to her car. And when she refused, he bludgeoned her and he beat her. But interestingly, he delivered her to the hospital. She died 3 to 4 days later. And then he went and decided, almost, in his perception, it was like, well, I've done that. I've brought her to the hospital. I still need to fulfill my compulsion to get more money. And so he decided, he still wanted to rob a bank. He was still on that course, and he decided he had seen an ad for a shotgun. He went to, I think it was County Offaly, and he met a farmer. And the farmer obviously wanted to be paid for this, and he didn't have the money to pay him, so he shot him. And later, a nolle prosequi was entered in that case, in the case of the shooting. So officially, he's only convicted of one murder, and obviously the other was taken into account, but a nolle prosequi. So it means the charges against him in relation to that were dropped. And now he served 30 years in prison. So those are the more high-profile killers, you know, that we've come across here in Ireland. So when Yousef Palani's case came up, it was definitely something that hadn't happened in a long time, and to hear about his MO and, you know, how he met his victims was so chilling, you know.
It might be worth mentioning, Ireland has produced one of these proper by the book serial killers by the name of Kieran Kelly, but he did his murdering over in London. Do you hear about that that TV show they're doing with his voice?
Oh no, I haven't.
There's an actor called Ned Dennehy. He was in Calm with Horses. I never saw it. But he does look quite a bit like the actual guy. And what they're doing is they're having the actor sit down and lip sync along with a recorded version, the recorded voice of the actual serial killer.
Right.
Having an actor. Right. I don't know if that's ever been done. It would be. It's almost like it. It's almost. I don't even know how I feel about it, but I'll probably watch it.
I know.
Kieran Kelly from the 50s to the 80s. Yeah, he killed I think he admitted to around 30.
In the UK.
From Ireland, but not didn't work in Ireland. Also worth mentioning, kind of have to be careful, but there is a very infamous convicted rapist named Larry Murphy.
Of course.
You can read online. He the thing he's convicted of
rape, abduction and attempted murder. Yeah. And he served 10 years. And in terms of, of course, and that's in the media again at the moment, because there's a Sky documentary about the Vanishing Triangle, which is what you're talking about, and the 6 women that went missing in that area of Leinster in the 90s.
I think the first one was in 88, which would put him at the age of 22. Now, I think I looked up last night the average serial killer, not that I'm saying he is, but the average serial killer, I think, starts killing around 28. Some in their early 20s, in his 20s anyway. Yeah,
and Larry Murphy, when he committed the crime, which he was convicted for, I think he was around 35. I think he was around 35. Born in, I think it was 1966 or 65. He was born in, but Larry Murphy and your listeners will probably know about the Vanishing Triangle. Of course, the first lady was Annie McCarrick, an American student who came over from Long Island, and she really had a love for Ireland, and her parents were Irish, and she came over in 1993. And then she vanished in April of 1993. Her mum was just about to visit a few days later. She was very excited about that. And she vanished from her. She was last recorded in Sandymount at an AIB in Sandymount that morning. And she had called a friend saying she was hoping she could go for a walk with her, but she said she was going to go to Enniskerry. So the last official recording or CCTV or still of her is in Sandymount in 1993, and then she vanished. And there were the investigation was so huge. Her mum came over. She wasn't reported missing for 48 hours because her flatmates had been gone for the weekend, and so they didn't know. And so there were a few issues in the meantime. She had bought food, non-perishable items that she just left inside the door. She did intend to come back and cook dinner the following night for her friends, but she vanished. And there was, sightings of her in various places like Johnny Fox's pub in the Dublin Mountains. And then there were sightings potentially of her getting on the bus, the 44 bus to Enniskerry. But then, the trail ran cold. But that case remains unsolved. Her dad passed away some years later. He had been, so tirelessly and relentlessly trying to appeal for information in relation to her disappearance, and her mum has taken part in documentary series, constantly wants to find her remains, to bring them home, and to finally get closure on this. But that was Annie McCarrick in 1993, and then we have Jojo Dollard in 1995, she went missing. She was last spotted at a phone box in Moon in County Kildare. And then there were 6 women, but the 3 women that Gardaí can't completely rule out that it was a serial killer involved in their disappearances. Now their cases have all been upgraded to murder. Also, Deirdre Jacob in Newbridge in Kildare, she disappeared at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon from just outside her home in Newbridge on the Barrettstown Road there in July 1998. So they're the 3 cases that Gardaí that we might be talking about here. And Larry Murphy was a person of interest in the Deirdre Jacob case because Deirdre was a student. She was walking home that day. He was said to be, he's a carpenter, a master carpenter, was said to be working nearby that day. And that was 1998, it was 93, 95, 98. And if you look at then, I suppose, the crime that he was actually convicted for, that he was caught, it's so chilling that he, you probably know the case. It was a woman in Carlow, a 28-year-old woman in Carlow. She, you know, his, you know, if this was his MO, it was stalking and, you know, hunting women. And he was an avid hunter as well, a pheasant hunter. He lived near the woods in Baltinglass, and that was a real hobby of his. But this was how he targeted women also. And in this case, he targeted her. He knew her routine. She was coming out of her shop. She had the takings for the day. He, even where he placed his car in the car park away from CCTV. And this was in 2000. And he again stunned her, punched her in the face, breaking her nose immediately. And she fell back into the footwell of her car. And he got into the car. And with such, you know, seamless, it was almost effortless for him. He had such strength as well. He pulled off her boots, you know, and so that she would feel vulnerable immediately. And he told her to take off her bra, and he tied her wrists together really tightly, you know, very quickly. It's so chilling when you look at and examine the details that you wonder, you know, has he done this before? And he drove then, he had his car in another place, and he drove then to the car, and then he drove her again from Carlow, you know, a good few kilometers, maybe around 40 kilometers, to eventually go back to near where he was living with his pregnant wife and 2 kids. So again, proximity, his local area, which he knew, you know, what was he going to do with this woman? He brought her, I think it was, he went to Beaconstown, so back towards County Wicklow, where he took her out of the car, raped her, and then he put her in the boot of the car again, drove close to Baltinglass Woods, Kilranall, I think it was, and he took her out again, and she was naked, obviously, at this stage. He was raping her, but very chillingly, she said he started to tell her, give her details about himself, personal details about, you know, that his wife was expecting, they were expecting another child, he lived nearby, and she thought, oh my God, this man is, I'm not going to live, I'm not going to survive here. And so miraculously, there were 2 guys who were lamping rabbits who recognized Larry Murphy from the area, and the lights shone on this woman, and he dropped her down and he took off in the car. But the next day he was arrested, and his house was searched, and you know, he admitted it. You know, he admitted abduction, attempted murder, and rape. And only for those 2 guys, who knows what would have happened there. And also, actually, there's certain reports this week that the family of Jojo Dollard are appealing for Gardaí to look in the area of close to where he lived in Baltinglass, in an underground chamber. I think it's this forensic scientist has said that there's an underground chamber there that the guards should search. That maybe there's something there, because if he was, you know, what ultimately we can only speculate as to what he was going to do that night, but that woman certainly felt that she was going to be killed. And I suppose with the guards, they have to manage the expectations of these families who are going through ongoing torture. Their loved ones are missing. They know they've been murdered, because it's a murder inquiry now. In Deirdre Jacob's case in 2021, I don't know if you remember the search of Taggartstown, this big area in County Kildare. And they announced that they were going to search this area because it emerged that it was from a tip-off from a guy who said around the night that she disappeared, that Deirdre Jacob disappeared from Newbridge, which would have been close by, that was in 1998 in July, that they saw a car backed into the woods there in Taggartstown, and that the boot was open, and this was suspicious activity. So the guards decided to search this area, thoroughly search it for a number of weeks. And they brought the media in. They invited us down to take shots and do a press conference. And they always wanted to manage the expectations, but they found nothing. And we really thought at that point they were very confident of finding Deirdre Jacobs' remains, but they found nothing. But in relation to Larry Murphy, we know obviously that a file was sent to the DPP and it came back. They're not going to prosecute him in relation to it. So that's an ongoing issue, and it's a story that, you know, gains legs constantly. You know, even recently there was a photograph apparently of a still of Deirdre Jacob in the post office just before she disappeared, and there's a man in the post office, or was it the AIB? It was either the AIB or the post office, and they've digitally enhanced that photograph, and it looks like it could potentially be somebody that looks like Larry Murphy, you know. So the guards, I suppose the most important thing, the guards, they're trying to manage the expectations of families, but they're also working way in the background, and you never know when these cases might be cracked, you know.
And of course, once so much time passes, God, I don't envy them having to piece together a case from so long ago, people's memory.
So long, and they're starting from scratch. They start from scratch again. So and then witnesses are gone, or people of interest, people who may have known them may have passed away at this point. You know, in the case of Anne McCarrick, there's two men, older men, who they're also talking to. It was earlier this year, actually, they upgraded that to a murder inquiry. So they were talking to, the reports that they were talking to two men, older men that may have been known to her at the time as well. So in relation to those three murders, disappearances and murders, presumed to be murdered, you know, they could certainly, or they can't be ruled out as being perpetrated at the hands of a serial killer, you know, at this stage.
Okay, very good. We'll move on to I guess the topic that I first saw your name. I was reading an Irish Examiner article about a horrific series of killings and an assault by a young man. He is 23, named Yousef Palani, up in Sligo. For anyone who's not familiar with Ireland, Sligo is by no means like some big city or anything. It's you know, it's kind of a corner. It's known as being kind of nice and quiet and stuff. You might take us through what happened there. The events took place over 4 days, involved someone having their eye stabbed out, and then later two brutal killings.
Brutal, and so shocking, and they're still reeling from that. I'd imagine the community there, you know, and he was only sentenced there. He pleaded guilty to murder there the week before last, I think it was, or 2 or 3 weeks ago. But Yousef Palani was from Iraq, Kurdish ethnicity, moved here in 2006 when he was just 6 years old. So if you kind of think of the context and the backdrop, it would have been the Iraq War. And soon after Saddam Hussein was toppled and then executed. So what he had seen in those formative years of his life, and what he'd experienced, and what he was exposed to, can't be discounted in looking at the factors that might have led to his certain types of behaviors. Now, it's a huge leap to say that's what caused this. Of course not. This is just examining, you know, a personality like his, ripped from his home, his experience of refugee camps, his experience of probably death and destruction and loved ones being killed, and being completely uprooted from where he knew, and then moving to Sligo in the northwest of Ireland. It was part of a UN program that him and his family were brought over here, and he is one of 8 siblings. So I think he was the second. Yeah. And so they were brought over in 2006, and they moved to Sligo, which is, as you said, in the northwest of Ireland, beside the sea. It was around 20,000 population, the town itself. And I lived there, as I was saying, I would have moved out of there at that point when he would have arrived. I think I moved out of Sligo in 2003, but he arrived, and his family were moved into a house in Markievicz Heights, which would be beside the GAA grounds there, Markievicz Park, which would be very well known here. And in terms of integration, we don't know what support, if any, that the family received, you know, in terms of integrating into the community there, because it doesn't seem like they really did, you know, and that's part of it, that lack of identity maybe for him. And I just want to preface this with the fact that I don't want, this is in no way any justification for his behavior. This is really about kind of looking at where he was coming from, I suppose, and it's all just looking at what he may have been feeling at the time. And then, so there were, and Circa Crowley, a colleague of mine who lives in Sligo, she did that really well in-depth article with local knowledge of what happened, and interviewed a lot of the residents in Markievicz Heights in the estate at the time. I think there's about 45 houses there. And so they would have known this family very well, but they kind of stuck out. And they described Yousef Palani as a troublemaker from the start. That he was, you know, disruptive, and they described an incident where when he was about 10 or 11, he was playing with the other kids just in the estate, that he started kicking the other kids. And of course the other parents would have been very upset by this, and then relations between the parents might have broken down. And they described him, you know, there was a lot of antisocial behavior on his part. And then when he went into secondary school, there was an incident of him pulling sinks off the wall in the bathroom. So taken on its own, you might think, oh, maybe he was just messing, but that's a very extreme move on his, you know, it's quite extreme there, you know, in terms of, it would take a lot of force. There might have been a lot of rage there that was manifesting. And when we go back to when he was ripped from his home country that was war torn, you know, obviously the human psyche will blank or block things out that they just can't deal with, otherwise it implodes. So, but it's still there within your cell structure, and it's going to come out in some way if you're not dealing with it. Not to say everybody who's traumatized like that as a child is going to do something like that extreme, and there certainly is a link between childhood trauma and crime, you know, and there is, you know, research to back this up. But when you think about childhood trauma leading to psychopathy, there's not enough potentially evidence to link them. But certainly in terms of trauma, you can be, if it's not managed correctly and treated correctly, you know, you can, you know, lose empathy, you can be desensitized, you know. And so from his point of view, pulling the sinks off the walls, take on by itself, there's something there. There's certainly a flag to be raised there. It might be an orange flag, but I just think that takes a lot of strength and aggression and frustration on his part. And apparently he only hung out with one other boy in the school, and he was a foreign national as well. So, you know, again, you have to question the integration into society as well. But the teachers, who were really shocked afterwards by what he'd done, described him as, you know, giddy, a bit daft, bit of a messer. So, you know, he came across as somebody who's kind of likable, but he also, you know, there was certainly antisocial behavior there that was an issue. And residents also said that, you know, he wasn't officially charged with anything, or sorry, he wasn't officially convicted of anything, but he certainly was arrested in relation to criminal damage, and they would have seen him in handcuffs. So he was, you know, known to the Gardaí to some extent. But how could they make that leap? You know, how could they ever predict what was going to happen? And then he went to college in the local IT, but he pulled out of college, and he was described as being extremely intellectually challenged. So he wasn't interested in learning. He wasn't interested in school. So he was, at the age of 23 when this happened, he was kind of adrift, really, and maybe trying to attach himself to something. And maybe, you know, the guard said that his actions, you know, these are the actions of a man who was, you know, had so much hostility towards and prejudice towards and hatred towards gay people. But you kind of have to wonder why. You know, was it because of repression? Was it because in his religion, as he told Gardaí, this is banned? But he did insist that he wasn't gay. But his MO was to, and again, he disappeared for a few months. This is what local residents said in the months before the killings, that he wasn't seen. It wasn't that he went missing, but he wasn't. They didn't notice him around. And then he reappeared a few weeks beforehand. They noticed. So that's really significant in terms of what was he doing in those few months? Was this him kind of trying to attach himself to something to gain some kind of notoriety, an identity for himself? You know, I did say in that article that potentially, and this is all speculation, like in terms of copycat killings, I was reading there about, I don't know if you've heard of it, Stephen Port in the UK, in London, who he targeted gay men on the LGBT app Grindr, and that was back in 2014, 2015. And he was sentenced to life eventually, but he targeted them on Grindr. They were gay men. They were all, I think he was approaching 40, he was 40, but they were a good bit younger than him, in their 20s. And he targeted them, lured them to his flat. He had come out, I think, in his 20s, and he had lived with his parents until he was in his 30s. And then he had purchased this apartment, and that's what he used to lure them to his flat. And when he lured them there, he, administered obviously toxic levels of the date drug. He raped them, and then he disposed of their bodies. And actually, it appeared in the media again around 2022, early 2022, when the Met were being critiqued and investigated in relation to how they investigated these killings, because they were being critiqued because they didn't link the 4 deaths quickly enough until after the 4th death. And in at least 2 of those killings, he left the bodies at a graveyard, the same area. And so when the postmortems were carried out, it looked like it was an overdose, but their phones were missing. So then they weren't suspicious initially. So just in terms of, there's so much out there. And from Yousef Palani's point of view, he had a lot of time on his hands. He was unemployed. He wasn't in college. And if there were some mental health issues potentially there, even though I know that he was assessed in the Central Mental Hospital, there was nothing there in terms of our insanity legislation that there was a mental disorder and he couldn't stop himself from doing what he did, and that he, didn't know the seriousness of his actions. But certainly there may have been, he may have been going through an episode where he wanted to attach himself to something, and he was really angry. And then there could have been a precipitating event where we also heard that there were TikTok videos that he deleted where he was interacting with a trans woman. And oftentimes when people, go out and carry out these spree killings, there is something that triggers them. So this is, again, all speculation. But in those few weeks or the months beforehand, what he was doing, that's the really important element of this. And will we ever know, because the guards went and found out he hadn't been radicalized. There was no link to terrorism on his behalf. And so they did their due diligence, and they were satisfied that this was just somebody who was driven by hate and prejudice against gay men. And what he did was he met his victims on Grindr, and he made sure his MO was that they were gay Irish men and living alone, very importantly, because he was planning ahead on how he was going to, kill them, carry out the killings. And so we heard about Anthony Burke, who survived, but is hugely traumatized, obviously, by what happened. He's lost the sight in one eye. He came across Yousef Palani on the app, and Yousef Palani came to his house, and he said, they were chatting about who he was chatting to on Grindr, and Yousef Palani, I think Yousef Palani actually mentioned Aidan Moffat, who was the next victim. And he was uncomfortable. Anthony Burke was uncomfortable because Yousef Palani was very much obsessed with tying people up, and Anthony wasn't interested in this. So he, eventually persuaded him to leave. But Yousef Palani then contacted him the next day on another app, which is more anonymous, and he came back to the house. And Anthony Burke, they engaged in some sexual activity, and it was consensual. So just being mindful that he said he's not gay, but there is evidence of that happening at least once in this series of incidents. And he just was very uncomfortable again with him. He kept his jacket on, he said, and he later found out he was carrying the knife in that jacket. And he eventually said, okay, you need to leave. So he walked him out of the house and away, and good luck. But unfortunately, Yousef Palani came from behind, I think, and stabbed him in the eye. So, and watched him collapse as the blood drained from his eye, and then took off on his bike. By the way, he was cycling to all of these areas. And you just have to think about Anthony Burke at this stage, trying to stay conscious, and the trauma of, he actually lost the sight in that eye. But Yousef Palani, from his MO point of view, he was setting out that night to kill Anthony Burke. There's no doubt about it. And he actually spoke to Anthony Burke about how many people he had been, in contact with. And Anthony Burke described it as a kill list of, I think, up to 12 people that he had. And that just shows, I suppose, Yousef Palani thought he was going to kill Anthony Burke, so it didn't matter what he said to him. And he left, and Anthony Burke, as I said, lost the sight in his eye, but also, obviously, he sought treatment in hospital, and he went to the guards. And it was the next day then that Yousef Palani obviously had contacted Aidan Moffat in the same way. Aidan Moffat was a 42-year-old man, again, living alone, an auctioneer, really well-known Fine Gael activist. And I think that was the Sunday, the 10th, and he left. He was out socializing, and he left, I think, in the afternoon or late afternoon, went home, and his body was found the next day after friends, raised the alert because they couldn't contact him. And his body, what Yousef Palani did to him was, obviously went to his place, and he stabbed him over 40 times. He decapitated him, placed his head on the bed facing the door, and it almost seems, and there was also a bottle of bleach as well, and it almost seems like he was starting out. It was very disorganized, and it almost seems like he was trying to find his signature, which is what serial killers do, so that I suppose those in authority know, well, this is he's marking his territory here. This is his, it's clearly the same person. And Yousef Palani, it's almost like he was trying to establish a signature for himself, which is really chilling and disturbing. And probably all because he was Googling and using, researching, previous killings. And his MO was very precise, but then the actual signature was a bit different. That was really chilling. And obviously those who came across it, shocked them to the core, the ambulance service, what they found there. Then, so it was 2 days later that he targeted Michael Snee, who he also contacted on the app. Again, Michael Snee, a gay man, 58, hospital porter, living alone. And these were all within a few miles of Yousef Palani's house. So he could cycle there within minutes, and this is also, in terms of serial killers, and starting out, they would carry out their crimes, in areas that they are familiar with. And this is what was happening here, that he knew he could, escape quickly on his bike, and he carried out the killings at their home. So Michael Snee was found by, I think it was his nieces the next day, because at this stage they had found Aidan Moffat's body, and then they had the report, the guards, from Anthony Burke, and so they were putting the pieces together. And at this stage, when they found Michael Snee's body, it was because the guards were going around. Anthony Burke was helping them in their inquiries in terms of the app and who Yousef Palani was in contact with. So they were going around Sligo contacting men who were gay, who might be a potential target. And so this was publicized, and people locally found out about this. And so his nieces went to warn him, and that's when his body was found. And he, again, was stabbed, I think it was over 20 times. And his hands were tied behind his back, as were Aidan Moffat's, actually. And in this case, Yousef Palani placed 2 knives in a cross on the bed. So again, a different, again, they were both hands tied behind their back, but a different signature, not very, very different, but still, they still, stabbings and atrocious stabbings, but the MOs were similar, but the signature was a little bit different. And it was at that stage that the net was closing on Yousef Palani. He didn't know this, but apparently on the 10th, after he'd killed Aidan Moffat, he was seen getting out of a car laughing. So that was really disturbing as well. And so in terms of, they found Michael Snee, or Anthony Burke, excuse me, helped the guards through the app to find out where Yousef Palani lived, and eventually they found out that some local person recognized him, said he lives here, and they arrested him after that. So it was really, in Sligo, it was shocking, and I suppose everybody locally would have known what happened and who was responsible. But in terms of the why, it's really hard for people to, I suppose, realize and to come to terms with kind of what happened there.
What do you make? It's very interesting, the kind of sequence of events. I think it probably tells us a lot about him. The fact that his first act, which he planned on being a murder, and stabbing someone in the eye, incredibly brutal. It's the type of thing that I think the normal human mind, if you did it, it would be, it would kind of haunt you. It would constantly be in your head.
Oh, but yeah, lack of. But he just detached himself. He was able to detach himself from what he was doing. Yeah.
And then the next day, he went on to do what was by far his most brutal act, like you said, decapitation, over 40 stab wounds. He did the place in the head, and then the next day, or sorry, the next killing had about half as many stab wounds.
Yeah,
it didn't involve something as brutal as a decapitation.
Yeah.
That kind of like time period between each. I was going to say that must tell us a lot about him. He must have been perfectly fine with it to do one brutal act and then go on to do his most brutal. And then maybe he took it down a notch.
And I suppose we don't know where he was going with this. I mean, the guards they're adamant, and they're probably, in terms of, they're playing it down, but they feel that he definitely was going to kill if he wasn't caught at that point. Thanks to Anthony Burke, if he wasn't caught at that point, that he would have gone on to kill at least 6 more people. And who knows what there wasn't a cooling off period. It was one, it was within the course of 4 days. It was very, very short cooling off period. So these are spree killings, as opposed to kind of a serial killer. You don't know where he was going to go with this. Was he going to continue over the course of that week and the next week? And then what was he going to do after that? Did he know he was going to be caught? Was he forensically savvy? It doesn't really seem so. Did he care if he was going to be caught? And you have to, was he balancing this up with, I don't care if I'm caught, because then I'll be notorious. I'll have made a name for myself. I have some sort of identity. I've attached myself to something. And that's that kind of really disturbed, looking for power and control that was driving him. From somebody who was, you could also say this was toxic masculinity on his part, or it was just somebody who felt really repressed in terms of his sexuality. He was frustrated with that. He was frustrated with, he wasn't getting anywhere in life. He was frustrated with his lack of, intelligence, his lack of being able to progress as a person. And then you have, of course, that trauma from when he was ripped from his home, his war-torn country of Iraq. And the fact that he didn't integrate into society over there, and he was looking at his life and wondering where he was going. And who knows what happened? There may have been a breakup of a relationship that we don't know about. I mean, he was denying that he was gay, so he's not going to admit that. But I don't think they found that trail, but who knows?
I was going to say, I mean, yeah, he can deny it all he wants, and he can say that's forbidden under Islam, but I think it's very clear. Like, you wouldn't, if he just wanted to kill gay men, that there would be no sex or no touching or anything before. He clearly gay, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when the sentencing took place, the judge was really, struck by this. And they're all human beings. Sometimes we forget that. And it was Mr. Justice Mary Ellen Ring. She wanted to see photographs of Aidan Moffat and Michael Snee to remember them like that, instead of the evidence that she'd obviously heard during the sentencing hearing, and, praising them for who they were, and the fact that they were so much loved in the community and so well known in the community. And also in terms of Anthony Burke, that was assault causing serious harm, that Palani was sentenced to 20 years for assault causing harm, as opposed to attempted murder, and that plea was accepted. But for Anthony Burke, he told of, his life has been ruined as a result of this. Like the trauma from losing the sight in your eye in any circumstances would be traumatic, but in those circumstances, and the fact that he had kept his sexuality to himself, and then he was publicly outed in a town that's not huge, 20,000 people, and that he said people look at him and stare at him, and that's what he feels so impacted by this. It's horrendous, but he's been so brave, and he has spoken to the media, and he seems like a really lovely man, and I really wish him well in his thing. Hopefully he can start to heal after this.
I can imagine it would be particularly you get like trust issues from it, given that the previous day he had met him and they had consensual sex, like,
and but his instinct was telling him this is wrong, there's something not right here, and I'm sure that God, and he tried twice. He walked him out of the house. It's really, really sad for him.
Okay, this is something that I've just kind of noticed. I mean, it was clearly homophobic attack. He was targeting gays. That was the whole thing. I've seen in general, there's been way less. I'm over here in America, so I only see what's online. I think there's been way less coverage of this than there should be, and in particular the angle, the kind of the homophobic angle. I mean, there's plenty of these publications. There's plenty of these publications who would write like 100 articles if someone got misgendered or something way smaller than that, but who aren't touching this at all. I don't know. I think the fact that he's Muslim and a refugee, I think a lot of people are really sensitive around that. They'd want to tiptoe around it. And there's a fear in today's media environment of being called racist or Islamophobic or or anything like that. Any opinions yourself as to why, if you think it has been getting less coverage than it should be, and why?
Yeah, well, it was certainly huge at the time when it happened in April 2022. It was massive, and when you're thinking about, I remember when the first for Aidan Moffat, there was news of Aidan Moffat's body being found, and then another body of a male, and that was shocking, and it was huge. And I suppose the guards caught him so quickly and charged him that then the media are silenced. In terms of all you can report on then is it's different in the States, isn't it? Where in terms of contempt of court, you're only allowed to report on what happens within the district court hearing once they're charged. You can't go into any background, you can't speculate. It's very, very much direct reporting, because you always have to think about this person is going to go on trial before a jury and they can't be in any way prejudiced. That's as basic as it is. But in terms of when it comes down to when everybody was probably expecting a trial, and a trial might sometimes get more coverage because it's going on obviously over a protracted period of time, and there are tidbits of information every day, and so it's a contained report from every day. But I suppose I think here it was pretty big. The reports were huge. It was front and center in terms of bulletins and newspapers and radio programs and TV programs. But as you say, it's globally and from an international point of view, you thought it would have attracted more attention. Yeah. I can't speculate. Yeah, I guess the fact that he wasn't, like, the guards were very adamant about this, and they'd done their due diligence on it, that he was not radicalized, and they looked into all of that. And of course, you remember the 350,000 in cash that they found in the house, and at the time, I'm sure they were thinking, "Oh my God, is he? Is there some organized crime element here?" But no, they could find absolutely nothing, and they would have contacted Interpol and contacted authorities abroad, and nothing came back. So they'll continue to look into that money, but they are thinking perhaps that they brought that with them, the Palani's, when they moved over here. And another interesting factor in this case was that his family completely disowned him. They didn't go to any of the court sittings after that. Oftentimes you find, even when somebody is, alleged to have carried out a horrific crime, their family are there in the background, but they didn't go to any of the court sittings, and they completely distanced themselves. And I think since it happened, I think Sarika's writing that his dad hadn't been seen since it happened, so from their point of view, can you imagine what they're going through in that small community where they already don't feel integrated? So I don't know what their plan of action is now, but you have to feel for them as well.
Okay, that's the Yousef Palani case. I remember before that, and I think it kind of put me on alert about like killings in Ireland. There was a very brutal, excuse me, murder of a young lady killed in the middle of the day, broad daylight. Yeah, we've spoken about it a bit before in the episode. You might take us through. It's particularly, I suppose you could say, horrifying. It wouldn't be any less horrifying if the guy knew her, or if it was a family member or a former partner. But none of those things applied here, and that's very, very rare for when a woman gets killed, you know.
Yeah, and very unsettling. I remember that time the whole country just went, oh my God, she was just going for a run. That was kind of the headline at the time. She was just going for a run. And it was after Christmas. It was the 12th of January, and everybody's like, oh, might have overindulged during Christmas time, and they get a new exercise regime going. And I think she had spoken to her mum about, I'm going to start walking down by the canal and exercising down by the canal. So this was something new that she was doing. So she left school. The CCTV captured Aishling Murphy leaving the school where she was a teacher, a primary school. And she went to her car and she drove to the car park near the canal, the Grand Canal in Tullamore, and she started exercising. And she had a Fitbit on, so that kind of monitored or tracked her in terms of her movements and when she started. And I think it started to, when the guards looked back and when her Fitbit was analysed, the erratic behaviour on her Fitbit started around 21 minutes past 3. So they're concluding, with everything else taken into account, that that's when Yousef Puska attacked her on the canal. And just to start out, Yousef Puska, from Slovakia originally, he moved to the Czech Republic. He was married with 3 children before he moved here in 2012, I think it was, and moved to Tullamore in 2015. Moved to Dublin first. He was a builder, moved to Dublin. His parents were still in Dublin at the time of this murder, in Crumlin. And he then moved to Tullamore and moved in with his brother and his brother's family in Tullamore. And that was the house in Muckla that his address was at, where he was living. But then he was on disability and he was unemployed because he had slipped a disc in his back. So at that stage, he had 5 children when he murdered Aishling Murphy. The guards have done background checks on him and they can't find anything in terms of anything that might chime in relation to where his movements and his locations and MO in relation to other murders. So they couldn't really. There is talk that there may be a sex offence there in the background in another country. But he was basically, every day for him, he said he was the homemaker taking care of the kids. But on that morning in particular, he was served his breakfast. Somebody who was hanging out with the men folk. He painted this picture of himself as being this, family man, this husband taking care of the children. But really what was going on in the background was he was on dating apps trying to meet women. And he was going to casinos. And I remember looking up his social media account at the time and downloading photographs of him for future reference. And in all those photographs, there's no photographs of his wife or family. It's all him drinking with his mates, and I thought that was interesting. But it was kind of very basic, I suppose. And again, you're wondering, if he was taking care of the kids, but what was he doing? He was on these dating apps. In terms of women, what was his opinion of women? Did he see women as subordinate, people he could exert power and control over? There's no doubt about it, but there was toxic masculinity there, even what he was doing and the way he was treating women that day. And ultimately, the extreme violence is what manifested. But in his case, and I think definitely sex and power went hand in hand for him, that he, viewed them as kind of a right as opposed to a privilege. Which then gave him the right to carry out the violence that he did. And I think in his case, that certainly that certainly was true. And so he was on dating apps, and it emerged. There was a report there in the Sun the other day that he was actually talking to another woman in the area, a single mother, but thankfully she never met him. So the guards believe that he was trying to meet women to kill, and they're very clear about that. That this was his MO. That was it. There's nothing, may perhaps to have sex with, but certainly to kill. And so that day he left the house around 11:30. Interestingly, on his push bike, didn't drive either, on his Falcon Storm bike, which became the focus of the appeals in later days. And he went around and he went around stalking women. And the first lady, he followed her towards a supermarket, and she noticed him, but then, continued, about her day. And then the second lady, it was really very chilling, actually, because it continued for a while. He followed her in one area, and then he followed her again near the canal, and she was walking her dog, and she noticed him. And at one stage she stopped to let him pass on the bike, but he kind of came up beside her and was staring at her. So she was really unsettled by this. And you can just imagine, but it was during the day, so you'd kind of go, okay. And then she came across him again, and she tried to avoid him by going down this grassy, muddy path, thinking he's not going to come down here on the bike. But he did. He followed her again. She eventually doubled back. She ran with the dog and then doubled back, and that's how she kind of shook him off. But she also chillingly says that she encountered Aishling Murphy on the Grand Canal that day. So Aishling would have just been starting out on her walk, around 3:00. And so that was two women that he clearly followed that day. And of course his defense was that no, he wasn't following them. But he did. And basically what he did was, he obviously came across Aishling Murphy, and immediately, she was walking, and it's clear probably from the activities of the Fitbit that he just came at her, attacked her. He cut her throat, and he stabbed her 11 times. And when those two witnesses who had been exercising as well came across, as I said, he was kind of on top of her in the ditch, holding her down, and they thought this was a sexual attack. And he was so aggressive towards them. They're like, we're going to call the guards now. They didn't have their phone, but he was so aggressive towards them that they feared for themselves. So they ran off and got help. But the injuries were so catastrophic at that stage to Aishling, nothing could be done. But that, again, it's so chilling to think that poor girl in those last few minutes couldn't even scream for her life, that he had cut her and injured her voice box and stabbed her 11 times. And when obviously locals found her, she had her gold chain with Aishling on, and her, they spoke about during the trial, she had that little pink hat, that bobble-headed hat and her scarf. And it's just because that's what everybody does, in January, and it goes out for a walk to clear their head after work, and that's all she was doing. And she was in a, really stable relationship, came from a really loving family, and her family are just so obviously distraught. And again, their healing is probably going to start now that the criminal justice element of it is hopefully over, even though he is appealing it. But that's what I was explaining earlier, that there was a suspect arrested, and he was released the following night. And then Yousef Puska came into the frame. What Yousef Puska did then was he hid in the brambles for, I think it was up to 4 hours. He was all scratched on his hands. There were obviously defense wounds there, and he was scratched from the brambles. And he contacted a friend of his. And the next that their CCTV captures him walking into his parents' apartment in Dublin, or apartment complex. And then the next morning, coming out, and there's an ambulance, he had self-inflicted wounds to his abdomen. And when he went into, he basically told the authorities, the hospital and the authorities, he'd been stabbed in Blanchardstown. And when the guards then became suspicious about him because of those wounds on his hands, there's even a photograph of those scratches on his hands. Eventually, he said that he admitted, I am the murderer, that he cut her. And at that point, it wasn't out in the media. We didn't know what her cause of death was, or how it had happened. We knew it was a physical assault. We didn't know what, had a weapon been used. And he had described it that he cut her in the neck. He cut her neck straight away. And so immediately, obviously, he became chief suspect. But he concocted a lot of different stories. So therefore, he admitted it there, but then he said he was given drugs, painkillers in the hospital. So, that wasn't a real confession, that he was maybe hallucinating. He came up with another story that he was self-harming when Aishling Murphy came along and was trying to intervene. And there was another story he concocted at that stage that, that somebody else had actually stabbed Aishling Murphy, that he was intervened, and that's how he got stabbed. So he came up with all these different stories. None of it was credible, really, really wasn't credible. I'd say it was a very, very difficult defense. And it was very clear from the get-go, the prosecution had a very, big and convincing case and tight case against him. And the jury convicted him of murder within 2 hours, thankfully. And interestingly, Mr. Justice Tony Hunt, who has actually presided over a number of really high-profile trials, said he was glad the jury didn't accept any of this nonsense. And he said, chillingly, there's evil in this room. And with Yousef Puska, we all tried to, just before, actually, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, there was a rumor from the very beginning that perhaps they were known to each other, that she was in the school, that she had made a complaint in relation to the children. And that was going around from the very beginning. But in fairness to the guards, they always said this is random. They were not known to each other. There was no connection between the two. And it was important. I think we try to look for a reason, don't we? And we can't deal with the fact that this was just random. This was a monster in our midst, who really displayed classic signs of toxic masculinity. And who knows if he would have continued, if he got away with that. Like, there was a suspect arrested who could have taken the blame, but if he had gotten away with that, what would he have continued to do?
I've already kept you enough. Thank you very much now for all your time. I'd suggest anyone who listens to this podcast should go and listen to your own. There'd be a good bit of overlap. Is there anything just before we go? Anything you want to leave us with there? Any final words?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Real Lives Untold podcast, and we were talking there about Larry Murphy and missing women. We have Alan Bailey, who we spoke to, an ex-detective sergeant who headed up Operation Trace at the time, and that's a really interesting episode of Real Lives Untold. And we also have an episode with Barry Cummins of RTE, who is the MC for the Missing Persons Day and has really focused on missing women during his career as a really, really super journalist. So there's a lot of interesting takes on that, and we're actually going to do a piece on Yousef Puska shortly as well, so that'll go out in the next few weeks. But thanks, John, for having me on. And these cases are horrific, and again, when we're looking at causes and we're looking into their psyches, it's all speculation, and also we don't want to take away from what's happened here or in any way look for justification for what they've done. That's important to stress.
There's a huge difference between justifying something and trying to understand it. Two completely different things. They're completely different.
Yeah.
I was going to say, okay, I know we have spent the whole thing talking about these two killers. Thank God they were both caught, and thoughts with their victims' families, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much for joining me.